The cabin door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the mountain's silence like a gunshot. Kimberly Garcia pressed her back against the rough-hewn wood, her breath coming in sharp bursts that clouded the frigid air. Outside, the wind howled through the pines with a sound like distant wolves. But inside, the only sound was her own ragged breathing and the steady crackle of the fire that cast dancing shadows across the log walls. She had done it. After 9 women before her had fled this place within days or weeks, she had looked Alan Cooper straight in his steel-gray eyes and told him no. No, she would not be leaving. No, she would not be running back down the treacherous mountain path to whatever waited for her in the valley below. The shock on his weathered face had been worth every terrifying moment that led to this one. The fire popped, sending sparks up the stone chimney, and Kimberly jumped at the sound. Her nerves were strung tight as piano wire, but beneath the fear lay something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. She moved away from the door, her worn boots silent on the wooden floor, and surveyed the cabin that might become either her salvation or her grave. It was larger than she had expected, built with the kind of solid craftsmanship that spoke of a man who planned to stay. The main room held a massive stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with books whose leather spines gleamed in the firelight. A ladder led to what she assumed was a sleeping loft, while a doorway revealed a smaller room that might serve as a kitchen. Everything was clean, orderly, and utterly masculine in its sparse functionality, but it was the details that caught her attention. The careful way the firewood was stacked, the books arranged not just by size but by some system that suggested frequent use, the single cup that sat beside the wash basin, as if its owner had been interrupted in his evening routine by her unexpected arrival. This was not the lair of a monster. Despite what the people in the valley whispered about Alan Cooper, the mountain man who ordered brides through the mail like he might order supplies. The memory of how she had come to be here washed over her like cold water. 3 weeks ago, she had been Kimberly Garcia, seamstress and spinster at 26, living in the cramped back room of her sister's house in Denver. Sarah Parker had made it clear that her charity had limits, especially with her own husband, Paul Davis, growing increasingly vocal about the burden of supporting his wife's unmarried sister. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like divine intervention at the time. Wanted, bride for mountain homesteader, must be of good character and strong constitution. Correspondence welcomed. Serious inquiries only. She had written 3 careful letters, each one more desperate than the last, though she had tried to hide that desperation behind neat penmanship and proper grammar. Alan Cooper's responses had been brief, practical, and strangely reassuring in their honesty. He needed a wife to help with the domestic duties of mountain living. She needed a home and a husband. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. What she had not expected was the man himself. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Alan Cooper stood 6 feet tall in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that looked like they could snap a man's neck without much effort. His hair was dark brown, shot through with early silver, and his face bore the kind of deep lines that came from squinting into mountain sun and wind. But it was his eyes that had stopped her cold when she first saw him waiting at the bottom of the mountain path with his pack horse and supplies. Gray as a winter sky, they held a wariness that matched her own, as if he too had learned that the world was not a kind place to those who dared to hope for more than survival. The journey up the mountain had taken most of the day, following a trail that seemed to exist more in Alan's memory than in any visible path. He had spoken little during the climb, offering only necessary warnings about loose rocks or steep drops, but she had felt his attention on her like a physical weight. When she stumbled, his hand was there to steady her. When she needed to rest, he found sheltered spots where the wind could not cut through her inadequate coat. He was watching her, evaluating her, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that she was failing some test she did not understand. It was only when they reached the cabin, and he began to explain the arrangements he had made for her comfort, that she realized what kind of test it had been. He had prepared a separate room for her, he explained in his careful, measured way. She would have time to adjust to mountain life before they discussed the more intimate aspects of their arrangement. He understood that she might find the isolation difficult after city life. If she decided the situation was not suitable, he would escort her back down the mountain and provide funds for her return journey to Denver. He was giving her a way out, just like he had given the 9 women before her. That was when something inside Kimberly had snapped. Not broken, but snapped into sharp focus. Like a photograph coming clear in a camera lens. She had not climbed this mountain, left behind everything she knew, and risked her life on a treacherous trail just to be offered another escape route. She had come here to stay. Checkpoint 1. The confrontation had been swift and decisive. When Alan finished his careful speech about her options, Kimberly had looked him straight in the eye and told him that she had no intention of leaving. Not in a week, not in a month, not ever. She had made her choice when she answered his advertisement, and she was not the kind of woman who changed her mind at the first sign of difficulty. The silence that followed had stretched between them like a taut rope. Alan's gray eyes had searched her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. She could see the moment when surprise gave way to something else, something that might have been respect or possibly concern. When he finally spoke, his voice held a roughness that had not been there before. "You do not know what you are saying," he had told her. "You do not know what winter is like up here. You do not know what it means to be cut off from everything and everyone for months at a time. You do not know me." But Kimberly had stood her ground. She knew enough, she had replied. She knew that she had nowhere else to go. She knew that the valley held nothing for her but dependence and pity. And she knew that she was tired of running from difficult situations. If he was willing to give her a chance, she was willing to take it. That was when Alan had walked out of the cabin without another word, leaving her standing alone in the growing darkness with only the fire for company. She had heard his footsteps on the porch, then the sound of wood being chopped with more force than strictly necessary. He had been out there for over an hour now, and she was beginning to wonder if he was planning to sleep in the barn rather than share the cabin with a woman who had refused his generous offer of escape. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cabin walls. She had gambled everything on the belief that Alan Cooper was a man of his word. But what if she had misjudged him? What if the stories whispered in the valley held more truth than she wanted to believe? What if she had just trapped herself on a mountain with a man who had no intention of honoring the arrangement they had made? She moved to the single window and peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the clearing where the cabin Saturday. She could see Alan's silhouette near the woodshed, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm that spoke of a man working out his frustrations on helpless logs. Even from this distance, she could sense the tension in his movements, the barely controlled energy that suggested he was wrestling with more than just firewood. The sight should have frightened her. Instead, it reassured her in a way she could not quite explain. A man who chopped wood when he was angry was not a man who took his anger out on defenseless women. A man who had offered her multiple ways to leave was not a man who intended her harm. Whatever demons Alan Cooper was fighting, they were his own, not hers. She turned away from the window and began to explore the cabin more thoroughly. The kitchen proved to be well stocked with supplies that would last through a hard winter. Sacks of flour and beans, jars of preserved vegetables, sides of bacon hanging from the rafters. Everything was organized with military precision, labeled and dated in a neat hand that matched the letters she had received. This was the home of a man who planned ahead, who thought about consequences, who prepared for every contingency, except perhaps for a bride who refused to leave. The books on the shelves drew her attention next. She had expected to find practical manuals about farming or animal husbandry, but instead discovered volumes of poetry, philosophy, and literature. Shakespeare sat beside Emerson, while Dickens shared space with technical treatises on engineering and geology. It was the library of an educated man, someone who valued learning and reflection, someone who might understand her own love of books and learning. She pulled down a volume of Wordsworth and opened it to find careful annotations in the margins, notes written in the same neat hand that had penned her letters. The poems about nature and solitude were heavily marked, while those about love and loss bore no marks at all. It painted a picture of a man who had found peace in isolation, who had perhaps chosen this mountain exile as much as it had chosen him. The sound of footsteps on the porch made her quickly replace the book. She heard the scrape of boots being cleaned, then the slow creak of the door opening. Alan stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of pine and wood smoke and something else that was purely masculine. His hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, and his shirt clung to his broad chest in a way that made her suddenly aware of how alone they were. He hung his coat on a peg beside the door and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. When he finally looked at her, his expression was unreadable. "You should eat something," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It has been a long day." The mundane suggestion broke some of the tension that had been building between them. Kimberly nodded and moved toward the kitchen, grateful for something practical to focus on. She found bread and cheese, cold meat, and preserved fruit. Simple fare that nonetheless tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks. Alan joined her at the rough table, eating in silence while the fire crackled and the wind continued its lonely song outside. It was Kimberly who finally broke the silence. "Why did the others leave?" Alan's hand stilled on his cup of coffee. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his words were measured and careful. The isolation was too much for most of them. "The winters here are hard. Months without seeing another soul, without hearing another voice. Some people are not made for that kind of solitude. But you are," she said. It was not a question. Alan's gray eyes met hers across the table. "I have had to be." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, but Kimberly found herself pushing anyway. "What about you? What brought you to this mountain?" For a moment, she thought he would not answer. He stared into his coffee as if it held secrets, his jaw tight with some internal struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet, she had to lean forward to hear him. "I was a different man once. I lived in the valley, had a business, friends, a place in the community. But sometimes, a man makes choices that change everything. Sometimes the only honorable thing to do is to remove yourself from the situation entirely." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Kimberly wanted to ask more, to understand what had driven this educated, capable man to exile himself on a mountain. But something in his expression warned her away. Instead, she asked a different question. "Do you regret it? Coming here?" Alan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the fire that cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls. When he looked back at her, there was something in his eyes that might have been surprise. "I thought I did not. Until today." Checkpoint 2. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Kimberly felt her heart begin to beat faster, though she could not say whether it was from fear or something else entirely. She had come here expecting a simple arrangement, a practical marriage that would give them both what they needed. She had not expected complexity or depth or the possibility that Alan Cooper might be as lonely as she was. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows and sending smoke back down the chimney in occasional puffs. Alan rose from the table and moved to bank the fire for the night, his movements efficient and practiced. When he turned back to her, his expression had returned to its earlier neutrality. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be difficult." Kimberly felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Difficult how?" Alan's jaw tightened. "There are things you need to know about living here. Things I should have explained in my letters but did not want to put in writing. The mountain has its own rules, its own dangers. If you are truly determined to stay, you will need to learn them quickly." The warning in his voice was unmistakable, but instead of frightening her, it only strengthened her resolve. She had not come this far to be intimidated by vague threats. "Then teach me," she said simply. Something flickered in Alan's eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Very well. But understand this, Kimberly Garcia. Once you truly know what staying here means, there will be no more chances to leave. The trail down the mountain becomes impassable once the heavy snows start, and that could be any day now. If you change your mind after that, you will be trapped here until spring." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they felt like a promise. She met his gaze steadily. "I understand." Alan studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read her soul. Finally, he nodded toward the smaller room off the kitchen. "That room is yours. I have prepared it as best I could. Tomorrow we will begin your education about mountain life. I suggest you get what rest you can." He turned away before she could respond. moving toward the ladder that led to the loft. Kimberly watched him climb, noting the easy way he navigated the rough wooden rungs, the careful way he moved to avoid making unnecessary noise. Even in his own home, he moved like a man accustomed to being alone, to disturbing no one and being disturbed by no one in return. Her room proved to be small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in thick quilts and a small table that held a basin and pitcher for washing. A single window looked out into the forest, though now it showed only darkness and the occasional gleam of moonlight on snow. Alan had even provided a chair and a small shelf for her few belongings. It was more consideration than she had expected, more than she had received in her sister's house despite months of grateful service. She unpacked her few possessions, hanging her spare dress on a peg and arranging her books on the shelf. The familiar ritual of settling into a new space helped calm her nerves, though she remained acutely aware of the man moving quietly in the loft above. She could hear the creak of floorboards, the soft sounds of someone preparing for sleep, and she found herself wondering what he was thinking. Did he regret his decision to let her stay? Was he already planning ways to convince her to leave once the snows made departure impossible? The questions followed her into an uneasy sleep, filled with dreams of gray eyes and mountain storms. She woke to the sound of movement in the main room and the smell of coffee and bacon. Dawn light filtered through her small window, revealing a world transformed by overnight snowfall. The trees stood like white sentinels in the early morning light, and the clearing around the cabin had become a pristine expanse of unmarked snow. It was beautiful and utterly alien to her city-trained eyes. Alan was already dressed and moving about the kitchen when she emerged from her room. He looked up as she appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," he said. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," she replied, though it was not entirely true. The silence of the mountain night had been unlike anything she had ever experienced, so complete that her own heartbeat had seemed loud as thunder. Alan poured coffee into a second cup and set it on the table. "Eat quickly," he said. "We have much to cover today, and the weather may not hold." As if to emphasize his point, the wind picked up outside, sending snow swirling past the windows. Kimberly ate the simple breakfast of bacon, eggs, and bread, while Alan moved about the cabin, gathering supplies and checking equipment with a methodical thoroughness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. When she finished eating, he handed her a heavy coat that was clearly too large for her frame. "This belonged to one of the others," he said without elaboration. "It will keep you warm while we are outside." The coat smelled of wool and wood smoke, and faintly of lavender, as if its previous owner had tried to bring something feminine to this harsh place. Kimberly wondered which of the 9 women had worn it, what had finally driven her to abandon it and flee down the mountain. The thought was not comforting. Alan led her outside into air so cold it burned her lungs. The snow crunched under their feet as he showed her around the property, pointing out the various outbuildings and explaining their purposes. The barn housed 2 horses, a cow, and several chickens, all of which would need daily care through the winter months. The smokehouse contained preserved meat that would supplement their diet when fresh food became unavailable. The root cellar held vegetables and supplies that had to be protected from freezing. Everything was designed for self-sufficiency, for surviving months of complete isolation. As they walked, Alan explained the daily routines that would keep them alive through the winter. Water had to be carried from a spring that might freeze, requiring them to melt snow. Firewood had to be cut and split constantly to keep the cabin warm. The animals needed food and care, regardless of weather conditions. It was more work than Kimberly had imagined, more responsibility than she had ever carried. But as Alan talked, she began to see the rhythm of it, the way each task connected to the others in an intricate dance of survival. It was challenging, yes, but it was also purposeful in a way her life in Denver had never been. The tour ended at a small shed that Alan unlocked with obvious reluctance. Inside, Kimberly saw something that made her blood run cold. Rifles hung on the walls alongside boxes of ammunition, while shelves held what looked like medical supplies and emergency rations. "This is what I meant about the mountain having its own rules," Alan said quietly. "There are dangers here that city people do not understand. Bears that have not yet gone to sleep for the winter. Wolves that grow desperate when game becomes scarce. And sometimes, men who think a woman alone on a mountain is fair game for whatever they choose to take." His words sent ice through her veins, but she forced herself to ask the question that had to be asked. Has that happened before? With the other women? Alan's expression grew grim. Twice. Both times, the women decided they would rather face the dangers of the valley than the dangers of the mountain. I could not blame them for that choice. But you stayed, Kimberly said. You faced those dangers alone. Alan's gray eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something raw and vulnerable in their depths. A man does what he must to protect what matters to him. The question is, what matters to you, Kimberly Garcia? What are you willing to face to have it? Checkpoint 3. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Kimberly looked around the small shed with its grim reminders of mountain dangers, then back at Alan's weathered face. She thought of her sister's cramped house in Denver, of the pity in Sarah's eyes and the growing resentment in Paul's. She thought of the long years stretching ahead of her as an unwanted spinster dependent on others' charity. She thought of the dreams she had abandoned one by one, as the world made it clear that a woman alone had few choices and fewer chances. I am willing to face whatever I must, she said finally. I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Something shifted in Alan's expression, a softening around the eyes that suggested her answer had surprised him. He nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then we begin your real education now. The next hours passed in a blur of instruction and practice. Alan taught her to load and fire the rifles, his hands steady and sure as he guided her through the motions. The first shot knocked her backward and left her ears ringing, but she gritted her teeth and tried again. And again. Until she could hit the target he had set up against a distant tree more often than she missed. He showed her how to read the signs of approaching weather, how to tell when the wind carried the promise of a blizzard that could trap them for days. He explained which plants could be eaten in an emergency and which would kill her, how to find water when the obvious sources froze, how to signal for help if she ever found herself lost in the wilderness. Most importantly, he taught her about the rhythms of mountain life, the way survival depended on constant vigilance and preparation. Every decision had consequences that might not become apparent for days or weeks. Every mistake could be fatal when help was days away, and winter showed no mercy to the unprepared. By the time they returned to the cabin, Kimberly's head was spinning with information, and her body ached from unaccustomed exertion. But beneath the exhaustion, she felt something she had not experienced in years. A sense of competence, of usefulness, of being genuinely needed rather than merely tolerated. Alan prepared their evening meal while she sat by the fire, absorbing the lessons of the day. When he set a plate before her, she looked up to find him studying her with an expression she could not quite read. You did well today, he said. Better than I expected. The praise warmed her more than the fire. Thank you for teaching me. Alan sat across from her, his own meal untouched. There is more you need to know. About me, about why I am here, about the dangers that are not just from wild animals or weather. Kimberly set down her fork, sensing that whatever he was about to tell her would change everything between them. I am listening. Alan stared into the fire for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing over words he was reluctant to speak. When he finally began, his voice was so quiet, she had to lean forward to hear him. My name is Alan Cooper, but that was not always the case. I was born Gregory Mitchell, son of a wealthy family in Philadelphia. I was educated as an engineer, worked on railroad construction, made a good living, and had prospects for better. I was engaged to be married to a woman named Frances Reed, daughter of my father's business partner. He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching. On the table, Kimberly waited, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever resolve had brought him to this moment of confession. Frances was beautiful, accomplished, everything a man of my position was supposed to want in a wife. But she was also spoiled, cruel to those she considered beneath her, and utterly without conscience when it came to getting what she wanted. I told myself that marriage would settle her, that responsibility would mature her. I was young and foolish and believed that love could change anyone. The bitterness in his voice was like acid. Kimberly found herself holding her breath, afraid to move lest she break the spell that had loosened his tongue. The truth came out 3 weeks before our wedding. Frances had been carrying on an affair with my best friend, Wayne Nelson, for over a year. But that was not the worst of it. She had also been systematically stealing money from the household accounts of several prominent families, using her social position to gain access to their homes and their trust. When suspicion finally fell on her, she claimed that I had forced her to do it, that I had threatened to break our engagement and ruin her reputation if she did not help me steal the money to cover my gambling debts. Kimberly's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. She could see the young man he had been, idealistic and trusting, destroyed by the betrayal of those he had loved most. The scandal destroyed my family, Alan continued. My father lost his business and died of a heart attack within 6 months. My mother retreated to her sister's house and refused to see me. Wayne Nelson married Frances and used the stolen money to buy his way into society in another city. And I became a pariah, unable to find work, unable to show my face in polite society, unable to prove my innocence because the evidence had been carefully arranged to point to my guilt. So you came west, Kimberly said softly. Alan nodded. I changed my name, took whatever work I could find, and eventually saved enough money to buy this land. I thought I could build a new life here, away from the lies and the betrayal and the memories. For 5 years I was content with solitude. But a man gets lonely, and he starts to think that maybe he can risk trusting again. So I placed that advertisement, hoping to find a woman who wanted the same thing I did. A fresh start, a simple life, a chance to build something real away from the corruption of civilization. And the 9 women who came before me? Kimberly asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. They took one look at this place, at the isolation and the hardship, and decided they would rather take their chances in the valley. I could not blame them. I had not been entirely honest about what life here would entail. But you are being honest with me. Alan's gray eyes met hers across the table. You refused to leave. You demanded the truth. I owe you that much. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of his revelation. Kimberly understood now why he had been so careful to give each woman an escape route, why he had expected her to flee like the others. He was a man who had learned not to trust, not to hope, not to believe that anyone would choose to stay when staying meant accepting hardship and uncertainty. But she also understood something else. The careful way he had prepared for her comfort, the patience with which he had taught her today, the obvious pain it had cost him to tell her the truth about his past. This was not a man who had grown cold and calculating in his exile. This was a man who had been wounded so deeply that he had forgotten how to heal, who had convinced himself that solitude was safety and that wanting more was foolishness. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows and sending smoke back down the chimney. Snow began to fall more heavily, the flakes visible in the firelight like tiny dancers performing against the darkness. Winter was coming to the mountain, and soon they would be truly alone together, cut off from the world below by weather and distance and the choices they had made. Alan rose from the table and moved to check the fire, adding logs with the practiced ease of a man who had spent many evenings alone with only the flames for company. When he turned back to her, his expression had returned to its earlier neutrality, but Kimberly thought she could see the effort it cost him to maintain that facade. You know the truth now, he said, about who I am and why I am here. If you have changed your mind about staying, tomorrow may be your last chance to leave safely. The weather is turning, and once the heavy snows start, the trail becomes impassable until spring. Kimberly stood and moved to face him across the small space of the cabin. In the firelight, he looked older than his years, worn down by solitude and the weight of secrets carried too long. But she could also see the man he had been, the idealistic young engineer who had believed in love and honor, and the possibility of building something beautiful with someone who shared his dreams. I told you yesterday that I had no intention of leaving, she said quietly. Nothing you have told me changes that. Alan's eyes searched her face as if looking for signs of deception or doubt. You do not understand what you are saying. You would be trapped here with a man who has been accused of theft and fraud, a man whose name was ruined by scandal. If anyone ever discovered who I really am, then we will face that together, Kimberly interrupted. Just as we will face the winter and the isolation and whatever other dangers the mountain holds. The words hung in the air between them like a vow. Alan stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You are either very brave or very foolish, Kimberly Garcia. Perhaps both, she admitted. But I am also very tired of being afraid, of running from difficulty, of settling for less than I deserve, of letting other people decide what my life should be. I came here to marry you and build a life on this mountain. That has not changed. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and the snow fell harder, beginning to pile against the windows in drifts that spoke of a long night ahead. But inside the cabin, something had shifted between them. The careful distance Alan had maintained was cracking, and beneath it Kimberly could see the loneliness he had carried for so long, the hunger for connection that he had tried to bury under layers of self-protection and resignation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and her ability to survive in this harsh place. But tonight, for the first time since climbing the mountain path, Kimberly felt that she had made the right choice. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it not as a woman alone and dependent on others' charity, but as someone who had chosen her own path and was prepared to walk it regardless of the cost. The fire crackled and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and outside the wind carried the promise of the first real storm of winter. But Kimberly Garcia was no longer afraid. She had found something worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth risking everything to protect. She had found a chance to become the woman she was meant to be. The sound of splintering wood from outside the cabin shattered the moment like glass. Both Kimberly and Alan froze, their eyes meeting across the firelit space as the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving through the forest reached their ears. Alan's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that hung above the mantel, his entire body tensing like a coiled spring. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Do not make a sound." But even as he reached for the weapon, the cabin door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying across the room. 3 men stumbled through the opening, their faces hard with cold and something far more dangerous. The leader, a tall man with cruel eyes and a week's worth of beard, swept the cabin with his gaze before settling on Kimberly with a smile that made her blood freeze. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. "Looks like old Cooper finally got himself a woman who stayed. And such a pretty one, too." Alan stepped between them, the rifle now in his hands but not yet raised. His voice was deadly calm. "You are not welcome here, George Lee. Take your men and leave." The man called George Lee laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I do not think so, Cooper. You see, we have been having a hard winter down in the valley, and we heard tell that you might have supplies to spare. Food, ammunition, maybe even a little female companionship to warm the cold nights." His companions, both rough-looking men with the lean hunger of wolves, spread out to flank Alan. One of them, a scarred man with missing teeth, kept his eyes fixed on Kimberly with an expression that made her skin crawl. The storm outside intensified, as if nature itself was responding to the violence that had entered the peaceful cabin. Snow swirled through the open door, and the wind howled like a banshee. But inside the tension was so thick it seemed to have weight of its own. Alan's knuckles were white where he gripped the rifle, but Kimberly could see the calculation in his eyes. 3 men against 1, and she was an untrained liability who could become a hostage at any moment. The odds were not in their favor, and they all knew it. George Lee took another step forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Now, Cooper, you can make this easy or you can make it hard. But either way, we are taking what we came for. The question is whether you want to live to see another sunrise." The cabin held its breath as George Lee's words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Kimberly felt her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat so loud she was certain the intruders could hear it. The scarred man with missing teeth had not taken his eyes off her, his gaze crawling over her body with a hunger that made her stomach turn. Behind him, the third man, younger but no less dangerous, fingered the knife at his belt with practiced ease. Alan remained perfectly still, the rifle in his hands but not yet raised to firing position. Kimberly could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his shoulders had set like stone, the careful calculation behind his gray eyes. He was outnumbered, but she sensed he was not outmatched. Not yet. The wind outside screamed through the trees, sending snow swirling through the open door in eddying spirals that melted instantly in the cabin's warmth. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows that made the scene feel like something from a nightmare. But this was no dream, and the cold steel of the guns these men carried was all too real. George Lee took another step forward, his boots crunching on the splinters of wood scattered across the floor. His smile never wavered, but there was something reptilian about it, something that spoke of violence enjoyed rather than merely employed. "Now, Cooper," he said, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a man who held all the cards, "I hear tell you used to be somebody important. Back east. Gregory Mitchell? Was it not? Son of a wealthy family, engaged to marry well, until that little scandal with the stolen money." Kimberly saw Alan flinch as if struck. The name hung between them like an accusation, and she realized with growing horror that these men knew exactly who Alan really was. This was not a random robbery by desperate men caught in a storm. This was something far more deliberate and infinitely more dangerous. "Oh yes," George Lee continued, his smile widening at Alan's reaction. "Word travels fast in small communities, especially when there is a reward involved. Seems your former fiancé's new husband is very interested in your whereabouts. Very interested indeed." The scarred man laughed, a wet sound that made Kimberly's skin crawl. "Wayne Nelson is offering $1,000 for information about Gregory Mitchell's location. Dead or alive, makes no difference to him." Alan's knuckles went white where he gripped the rifle, but his voice remained steady. "Francis and Wayne can go to hell. I have done nothing wrong, and you know it." "Maybe so," George Lee said with a shrug that suggested he cared little for the truth one way or another. "But that does not matter much to us, does it, boys? $1,000 is $1,000, and winter has been hard. A man has to make his living however he can." The younger man by the door shifted his weight, and Kimberly caught the glint of metal as he eased his pistol from its holster. The movement was subtle, practiced, but Alan saw it too. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop another 10 degrees as the reality of their situation crystallized. These men had not come here seeking shelter from the storm. They had come to collect a bounty, and they clearly had no intention of leaving witnesses behind to tell the tale. The isolation that had once seemed like Alan's protection had become a trap. No one would hear the gunshots over the howling wind. No one would find their bodies until spring, if ever. But even as despair clawed at her throat, Kimberly felt something else rising within her. The same stubborn determination that had brought her up this mountain, that had made her refuse Alan's offers of escape. She had not come this far, had not finally found a place where she belonged, only to watch it be destroyed by men like these. Her eyes swept the cabin, cataloging possible weapons, escape routes, anything that might tip the odds in their favor. The poker by the fireplace was too far away. The kitchen knives were in the other room. But there, hanging on the wall near the door, where the younger man stood guard, was a second rifle. If she could reach it, if she could remember what Alan had taught her about loading and firing, the thought was madness. She was one small woman against 3 armed men. She had fired a rifle exactly once in her life, and that had been at a stationary target in daylight with Alan's steady hands guiding her. But as she looked at Alan's tense form, at the way he held himself ready to die fighting rather than surrender, she knew that madness might be their only chance. George Lee was still talking, his voice a low rumble of threats and false promises. But Kimberly was no longer listening to his words. Instead, she was watching the pattern of shadows cast by the fire, calculating distances and angles, waiting for the moment when the attention of all 3 men would be focused elsewhere. That moment came when Alan finally raised his rifle, the movement smooth and deliberate despite the odds against him. George Lee's smile faltered as he found himself staring down the barrel of a weapon held by a man who clearly knew how to use it. "Now that is not very neighborly, Cooper," George Lee said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You are outnumbered 3 to 1. Even if you get me, my boys will cut you down before you can reload." "Maybe," Alan replied, his voice deadly calm, "but you will still be dead. The question is whether that is a trade you are willing to make." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each man waiting for the other to make the first move. The fire crackled, and the wind howled, but inside the cabin the silence was so complete that Kimberly could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. That was when she moved. She had been edging slowly toward the wall, using the shadows and the men's focus on Alan to mask her movement. Now she lunged for the second rifle, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the barrel just as the scarred man noticed her motion. "The woman!" he shouted, swinging his pistol toward her. But Kimberly was already moving, rolling behind the overturned table as bullets splintered the wood above her head. The rifle was heavier than she remembered, awkward in her trembling hands, but she forced herself to recall Alan's patient instruction from earlier that day. Load, aim, fire. The steps seemed simple enough, but with death whistling overhead and her heart hammering like a trip hammer, nothing felt simple anymore. The cabin exploded into chaos. Alan's rifle boomed, and George Lee screamed as the bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild. The younger man by the door was cursing and trying to get a clear shot at Alan without hitting his companions. The scarred man was advancing on Kimberly's position, his gap-toothed grin promising unspeakable things. Kimberly's hands shook as she tried to load the rifle, the cartridge slipping from her fingers to roll across the floor. The scarred man was almost on top of her now, his pistol trained on her head, when Alan's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Touch her and die." The words carried such cold promise that even the scarred man hesitated. In that moment of pause, Kimberly's fingers found another cartridge, and this time her hands were steady as she slammed it home and raised the rifle to her shoulder. The scarred man's eyes widened as he found himself staring down the barrel of her weapon. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Then Kimberly pulled the trigger. Checkpoint. 7. The recoil knocked her backward, and the sound was deafening in the enclosed space. But through the ringing in her ears, she heard the scarred man's scream of pain and rage. Her shot had taken him in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and curses. Alan was already moving, working the bolt of his rifle with practiced efficiency. But the younger man by the door had finally found his angle, and his pistol was swinging toward Alan's exposed back. "No!" Kimberly screamed, but her voice was lost in the thunder of gunfire. The bullet meant for Alan went wide as the wounded, scarred man, writhing on the floor, accidentally knocked into his companion's legs. The shot shattered a jar of preserves on the shelf, sending glass and peach syrup cascading to the floor. George Lee was trying to raise his own weapon, despite the blood streaming from his shoulder wound. His face was twisted with pain and fury, and Kimberly could see murder in his eyes. But Alan was faster, his second shot taking the outlaw leader's center mass and dropping him where he stood. The younger man, seeing his leader fall, made a desperate lunge for the door, but his boots slipped on the mixture of snow and blood that now covered the cabin floor, and he went down hard, his pistol skittering away into the shadows. The scarred man was still alive, clutching his wounded leg and moaning. His pistol lay just out of reach, but his eyes were fixed on it with desperate longing. Kimberly kept her rifle trained on him, her hands no longer shaking despite the violence she had just witnessed. Alan moved through the cabin like an avenging angel, collecting weapons and checking the fallen men with grim efficiency. George Lee was dead, his sightless eyes staring at the ceiling. The younger man was unconscious, a growing pool of blood beneath his head where he had struck the floor. Only the scarred man remained awake, his breathing shallow and his face gray with shock. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was passing. Kimberly lowered her rifle with trembling hands, the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. She had shot a man. She had looked another human being in the eye and pulled the trigger, sending a bullet into his flesh with intent to harm. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, she felt only a cold satisfaction. These men had come to her home with violence in their hearts. They had threatened the man she was beginning to care for, had looked at her with eyes that promised violation and death. They had gotten exactly what they deserved. Alan appeared at her side, his hands gentle as he took the rifle from her nerveless fingers. His face was grim, but when he looked at her, she saw something that might have been pride in his gray eyes. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Kimberly shook her head, not trusting her voice. She was not hurt, not physically, but something inside her had changed in the last few minutes. The frightened woman who had climbed this mountain seeking safety and security was gone, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, more capable of surviving in this harsh world. Alan turned his attention to the wounded man on the floor. The scarred outlaw's breathing was becoming more labored, and the pool of blood beneath his leg was spreading steadily across the wooden planks. You are bleeding out, Alan said matter-of-factly. You have maybe an hour, maybe two if you are lucky. I can help you, or I can let you die. Your choice. The wounded man's eyes blazed with hatred, but pain and fear were stronger than pride. Help me, he gasped. Please. Alan knelt beside him, his hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the wound. The bullet had missed the major artery, but it had shattered bone and torn muscle. Without proper medical attention, the man would indeed bleed to death. First, you are going to answer some questions, Alan said as he began to cut away the man's trouser leg. How did you know who I was? How did you find me? The wounded man's face contorted with pain as Alan probed the wound. Wayne Nelson, he gasped. He has been asking questions, offering money for information. Someone in the valley recognized you from an old photograph. Who? Alan's voice was deadly quiet. The wounded man hesitated, and Alan's hands stilled on the bandage he was preparing. The bleeding increased immediately, and the man's face went another shade paler. Karen Williams, he said quickly, the postmaster's daughter. She remembered you from when you first came through town 5 years ago. Nelson showed her a photograph, and she identified you. Kimberly felt her blood turn to ice. Karen Williams was one of the women who had answered Alan's advertisement. One of the 9 who had fled the mountain rather than stay and face the hardships of winter isolation. She knew where the cabin was located, knew Alan's habits and routines. If she had betrayed him to Wayne Nelson, then this attack was just the beginning. How many others know? Alan asked as he resumed his work on the wound. The scarred man's breathing was becoming more shallow, but his eyes remained focused with the desperation of a man clinging to life. Nelson has been spreading word through the mining camps, he said, offering 500 for information, 1,000 for proof of death. There will be others coming, especially when we do not return. Alan finished bandaging the wound with swift, efficient movements. The bleeding had slowed, but the man was still in serious condition. Without a doctor, his chances of survival were slim. The storm will cover your tracks for now, Alan said as he stood. But come spring, there will be questions about what happened to George Lee and his men. The wounded man struggled to sit up, his face twisted with pain and desperation. You cannot leave me here, he said. I will die without help. Alan looked down at him with cold eyes. You came here to kill me and take my woman. You got what you came looking for, just not the way you expected. But Kimberly found herself stepping forward, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling through her. We cannot just let him die, she said. Whatever he intended, we are not murderers. Alan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he nodded curtly. We will take him to the root cellar. It is warmer than the barn, and he will be out of the weather. But come morning, he leaves this mountain. If he can walk, he walks. If he cannot, we will drag him to the edge of the property and leave him for the wolves. The wounded man's face went white, but he nodded frantically. Understood, he gasped. I will leave. I swear it. Alan turned to the unconscious younger man, checking his pulse with professional efficiency. This one will live, he said. Concussion, but nothing that will not heal. He will be sore for a few days, but he can travel. They spent the next hour cleaning up the aftermath of the battle. George Lee's body was wrapped in canvas and dragged outside, where the storm would cover it until morning. The unconscious man was carried to the barn, where he could recover without being a threat. The wounded, scarred man was helped to the root cellar, where blankets and water were provided for his comfort. Throughout it all, Kimberly moved with a calm efficiency that surprised her. She helped carry bodies, clean blood from the floor, and organize supplies without flinching. The violence that had erupted in their peaceful cabin had changed her, had awakened something fierce and protective that she had not known existed within her. When the work was finally done, she and Alan sat by the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey that he had produced from some hidden cache. The alcohol burned her throat, but it helped steady her nerves and quiet the trembling in her hands. You did well tonight, Alan said quietly. Better than most men would have done in the same situation. Kimberly stared into the flames, watching the way they danced and flickered like living things. I killed a man tonight, she said. Or tried to. I should feel something about that. Should I not? Guilt? Remorse? Something? Alan was quiet for a long moment, his own gaze fixed on the fire. The first time I killed a man, I was sick for 3 days, he said finally. Could not eat, could not sleep, could not stop seeing his face. I thought there was something wrong with me, that I was not man enough to handle the reality of violence. What changed? Kimberly asked. Alan took another sip of whiskey, his expression distant with memory. I realized that feeling sick about taking a life meant I was still human. It was when I stopped feeling sick that I would need to worry. They sat in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside, while the fire crackled and warmed the space between them. But even as her body began to relax, Kimberly's mind was racing. The attack tonight had changed everything. Their peaceful isolation was shattered, their safety compromised. Wayne Nelson knew where they were, and he would not stop sending men until Alan was dead. Checkpoint 8. The implications of their situation began to crystallize in Kimberly's mind, like frost forming on a window. They could not stay here, not with bounty hunters knowing their location, but they could not leave either, not with winter closing in and the trail down the mountain becoming more treacherous by the hour. They were trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea, with enemies closing in from below and the harsh mountain winter sealing them in from above. Alan seemed to be thinking along the same lines. His face was grim as he stared into the fire, and she could see the wheels turning behind his gray eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with reluctant acceptance. "We cannot stay here," he said. "Not now that they know where to find us. But the storm makes leaving impossible, at least for the next few days." "How long do we have?" Kimberly asked. Alan considered the question, his gaze moving to the window where snow continued to pile against the glass. "This storm will last at least 2 more days, maybe 3. After that, there will be a brief window when travel might be possible, but it will be dangerous. The trail will be icy, visibility will be poor, and the cold will be brutal." "And if we stay?" Alan's expression darkened. "More men will come, maybe not immediately, but as soon as the weather clears enough for travel. Nelson has put a price on my head, and there are plenty of desperate men in these mountains who would kill for a fraction of what he is offering." Kimberly felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cabin walls. "Where would we go?" she asked. "If we leave here, where could we possibly be safe?" Alan was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched around his cup of whiskey. "There are places," he said finally, "remote areas where a man and woman could disappear, start over with new names and new lives, but it would mean leaving everything behind, abandoning any hope of clearing my name or returning to civilization." The weight of what he was asking settled on Kimberly's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He was offering her a life as a fugitive, always running, always looking over their shoulders, never able to put down roots or build anything permanent. It was not the future she had imagined when she answered his advertisement, not the simple mountain life she had dreamed of during those long nights in her sister's cramped house. But as she looked at his weathered face, at the pain and resignation in his gray eyes, she realized that her dreams had already changed. Somewhere in the space between climbing this mountain and firing a rifle at armed intruders, she had stopped wanting safety and started wanting something far more dangerous. She wanted this man, this complicated, wounded, honorable man who had been willing to die protecting her. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows and sending smoke back down the chimney in occasional puffs. But inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was building. The careful distance they had maintained, the polite formality of their arrangement, was crumbling under the weight of shared danger and mutual dependence. Alan set down his cup and moved to check the locks on the door and windows, his movements tense with barely controlled energy. The attack had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, not because of the physical danger, but because it had forced him to confront the possibility of losing something he had not realized he valued. When he returned to the fire, Kimberly was waiting for him with a question that had been burning in her mind since the shooting stopped. "Why did you save me?" she asked quietly. "You could have let them take me, use the distraction to escape. It would have been the practical thing to do." Alan's hands stilled on the poker he had been using to stir the fire. When he looked at her, there was something raw and vulnerable in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. Because you refused to leave, he said simply. Because you looked me in the eye and told me you were not afraid of the mountain or the isolation or the man I used to be. Because for the first time in 5 years, I had something worth protecting. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Thank you, successes, that U.S. comments on. But the events of the evening had stripped away their careful pretenses, had forced them to confront the truth of what was growing between them. Kimberly rose from her chair and moved to stand before him, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his gray eyes. When she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the rapid beating of her heart. I am still not afraid, she said. Not of the mountain, not of the winter, not of the men who want to hurt you, and I am not afraid of you. Gregory Mitchell. The sound of his real name on her lips seemed to break something inside him. His carefully maintained control cracked, and she saw the loneliness and longing he had been hiding behind his stoic facade. When he reached for her, his hands were gentle despite their obvious strength, and when he pulled her into his arms, she went willingly. The kiss was everything their careful courtship had not been. Desperate, hungry, full of the knowledge that they might not have another chance to express what they felt for each other. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the space between them crackled with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. But even as passion flared between them, the reality of their situation intruded like cold water. They were still trapped on a mountain with wounded enemies nearby, and more threats coming with the dawn. The intimacy they had just shared might be their last if they could not find a way to survive the challenges ahead. Alan seemed to realize this at the same moment she did. He stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, and the careful mask of control slipped back into place. We should rest, he said, though his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. Tomorrow we will need to make plans, decide how to handle the survivors, and what to do about Nelson's bounty. Kimberly nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to close the distance between them again. The practical part of her mind knew he was right. They needed to think clearly, to plan carefully, if they were going to survive the next few days. But as she prepared for bed in her small room, she found herself thinking not about the dangers that awaited them, but about the way Alan had looked at her when he said she was something worth protecting. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, she was no longer alone. She had found not just a husband but a partner, someone who would stand with her against whatever the world might throw at them. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The careful distance between them had collapsed, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous. They were no longer simply two people thrown together by circumstance and necessity. They were allies, partners, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and were determined not to let go. But even as hope bloomed in her chest like a flower in spring, Kimberly could not shake the feeling that their trials were far from over. Wayne Nelson would not give up easily, and there were other dangers lurking in the mountains beyond simple bounty hunters. The winter ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine, and the choices they made in the coming days would determine whether they survived to see another spring. Checkpoint 9. Dawn came gray and bitter, with the storm finally beginning to exhaust itself against the mountain peaks. Kimberly woke to the sound of movement in the main room and emerged from her small chamber to find Alan already dressed and checking his weapons with methodical precision. His face was grim in the pale morning light, and she could see the weight of difficult decisions in the set of his shoulders. The wounded man in the root cellar was still alive, though his condition had worsened during the night. His breathing was shallow and labored, and fever had begun to set in despite Alan's competent field medicine. The younger man in the barn had regained consciousness but remained dazed and compliant, seemingly more concerned with his aching head than with thoughts of revenge or escape. "We need to move them today," Alan said as they shared a simple breakfast of coffee and cold biscuits. "The storm is passing, and I want them off this mountain before the next one hits." Kimberly nodded, though the thought of the treacherous trail and winter conditions made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Can the wounded one travel?" Alan's expression was doubtful. "He has lost a lot of blood, and infection is setting in, but he will have to manage. I will not have him dying here and bringing more questions to our door." They spent the morning preparing for the grim task ahead. Alan loaded supplies onto his pack horse, while Kimberly gathered medical supplies and food for the journey. The plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. They would escort both survivors to the edge of Alan's property, then send them on their way with enough supplies to reach the valley below. After that, the men would be on their own. The wounded man, whose name they had learned was Jake Morrison, was barely conscious when they helped him onto Alan's spare horse. His face was gray with pain and fever, and Kimberly found herself wondering if he would survive the journey down the mountain. The younger man, who called himself Billy Crawford, was in better condition but clearly terrified of what awaited him in the valley below. George Lee had been the leader of their small band of outlaws, and without his protection, the survivors would be vulnerable to the justice of whatever law existed in the rough mining communities. The journey to the property line took most of the day, following treacherous paths made even more dangerous by ice and snow. Alan led the way, his experienced eye picking out the safest routes, while Kimberly brought up the rear, her rifle ready in case either of their unwilling guests decided to cause trouble. But both men seemed too concerned with survival to attempt any heroics. At the boundary marker, a weathered post driven into the rocky ground years before, Alan called a halt. The trail beyond continued down into the valley, but it would be a harrowing descent even for healthy, experienced travelers. For a wounded man and his shaken companion, it might well prove fatal. "This is where we part company," Alan said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You have supplies for 3 days if you are careful. The trail is marked well enough that you should be able to follow it even in poor weather. What happens after that is up to you." Jake Morrison swayed in his saddle, his face twisted with pain and something that might have been desperation. "You cannot just leave us," he gasped. "I need a doctor. Real medical attention. I will die out here." Alan's expression remained implacable. "You should have thought of that before you came to my home, with murder in your hearts. You made your choices. Now live with the consequences." Billy Crawford, who had been silent throughout the journey, finally found his voice. "What about Nelson's bounty?" he asked. "What do we tell him when he asks about Cooper?" Alan's gray eyes were cold as winter steel. "You tell him that Gregory Mitchell is dead. You tell him that we killed him in the fight, that his body is buried somewhere on this mountain where it will never be found. You tell him whatever lie you think he wants to hear, but you make sure he believes it." The young outlaw's face went pale as he grasped the implications. "You want us to lie to Wayne Nelson? He will kill us if he finds out we are deceiving him." "Then you had better be convincing," Alan replied without sympathy. "Because if he sends more men up this mountain looking for me, I will assume you told him the truth. And next time, I will not be so generous with my mercy." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Both surviving outlaws understood the choice they were being given. Lie to Wayne Nelson and risk his wrath, or tell the truth and face Alan's vengeance. Neither option offered much hope for a long and healthy life. Jake Morrison managed to straighten in his saddle, though the effort clearly cost him. "We will tell him you are dead," he said through gritted teeth. "But this is not over, Cooper. Nelson has a long reach, and he does not forget his enemies easily." Alan's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was not lost on either man. "Neither do I," he said quietly. With that final exchange, the two survivors began their treacherous descent toward the valley below. Kimberly watched them go with mixed emotions. Part of her felt pity for their obvious suffering, but a larger part remembered the way they had looked at her in the cabin, the violence they had brought to her home. Whatever fate awaited them in the valley below, they had earned it through their own actions. The journey back to the cabin passed in relative silence, both she and Alan lost in their own thoughts. The immediate threat had been dealt with. But larger questions remained. Would the survivors keep their word about reporting Alan's death? Would Wayne Nelson believe their story, or would he send more men to verify their claims? And what would happen when spring came and the regular supply runs resumed, bringing news and gossip from the valley below? By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The familiar sight should have been comforting, but instead it felt ominous, as if the mountain itself was warning them of trials yet to come. Inside, the cabin felt different somehow. The violence of the previous night had left invisible scars, and Kimberly found herself jumping at every creak of the settling logs, every whisper of wind through the eaves. Alan seemed to sense her unease, and his presence became more protective, more watchful, as if he expected new threats to emerge from every shadow. They prepared dinner in companionable silence, but the easy intimacy of the previous evening had been replaced by a tension that neither seemed willing to address directly. The kiss they had shared felt like something from another lifetime, a moment of vulnerability that the harsh reality of their situation had made seem almost foolish in retrospect. It was only when they were sitting by the fire, sharing the last of the whiskey from the night before, that Alan finally voiced what they were both thinking. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "Even if those men keep their word about reporting my death, there will be questions eventually. People will wonder what happened to George Lee and his gang. Someone will come looking for answers." Kimberly stared into the flames, watching the way they danced and flickered like living things. "So what do we do?" she asked. "Do we run, like you suggested last night? Find some remote place where we can start over with new names?" Alan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. "There is another option," he said finally. "One I have been considering since we sent those men down the mountain." Kimberly looked at him expectantly, sensing that whatever he was about to propose would be dangerous, desperate, or both. "We could go to the authorities ourselves," Alan said. "Tell them the truth about what happened here, about Wayne Nelson's bounty and the men he sent to collect it. With the right evidence, we might be able to turn the tables on him, make him the hunted instead of the hunter." The suggestion was so unexpected that Kimberly felt her breath catch in her throat. "You would risk exposure? Risk going back to face the charges that drove you up here in the first place?" Alan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I am tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting other people define who I am and what I am worth. Maybe it is time to fight back, to reclaim the life that was stolen from me." The words carried a weight of determination that sent a chill down Kimberly's spine. She could see the appeal of his plan, the way it offered a chance to end their exile and return to civilization as free people. But she could also see the enormous risks involved, the possibility that their gamble would fail and leave them both facing the hangman's noose. "What kind of evidence would we need?" she asked, her practical mind already working through the logistics of such a desperate plan. Alan leaned forward, his eyes bright with the fire of a man who had found new purpose. "Testimony from the survivors about Nelson's bounty, documentation of the money he has been spreading around the mining camps, proof that he orchestrated the attack on us. It would not be easy to gather, but it might be possible if we were careful and clever about it. And if we fail, if the authorities do not believe us, or if Nelson has more influence than we realize, then we will be no worse off than we are now," Alan replied, "except that we will have tried to fight back instead of simply accepting defeat." Checkpoint 10. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars seeking their way home. Outside, the wind had finally begun to die down, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to have weight of its own. But inside the cabin, the air fairly hummed with the electricity of a decision that would change everything. Kimberly studied Alan's face in the flickering firelight, seeing not the resigned exile she had first met, but a man rediscovering his own strength and purpose. The attack had awakened something in him, had reminded him that he was not just a victim of circumstances, but someone capable of fighting back against the forces that had driven him from his old life. But even as she admired his newfound determination, she could not ignore the very real dangers his plan would entail. Wayne Nelson was wealthy, connected, and utterly without scruples. He had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence to achieve his goals, and there was no reason to believe he would hesitate to escalate further if threatened. "There is something else to consider," she said carefully. "If we go to the authorities, if we make ourselves visible again, there will be no going back to this life. No matter how things turn out, we will never again have the peace and isolation we found here." Alan nodded, his expression grave. "I know. And I would not ask you to make that sacrifice if I thought there was any other way. But the truth is, that peace was always an illusion. As long as Nelson and Francis are out there, as long as they know I am alive, we will never truly be safe." The weight of his words settled between them like a stone dropping into still water. Kimberly realized that he was right, that the attack had shattered more than just their cabin door. It had destroyed the carefully constructed fantasy that they could simply disappear into the wilderness and leave their old lives behind. But there was something else in his proposal that gave her pause, something that spoke to her own need for justice and vindication. She had spent so many years accepting whatever life handed her, bending to the will of others, allowing herself to be defined by their expectations and limitations. The woman who had climbed this mountain, seeking only safety and security, was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more dangerous, more willing to fight for what she believed in. If we do this, she said slowly, we do it together. As partners, as equals, not as a man protecting his woman, but as two people who have chosen to stand against injustice. Alan's eyes searched her face, and she saw surprise and something that might have been pride in their depths. You understand what you are saying? You understand the risks? I understand that I am tired of being afraid, Kimberly replied. Tired of running from difficult situations. Tired of letting other people decide what my life should be. If you are willing to fight for the truth, then so am I. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. They were committing themselves to a course of action that might lead to vindication and freedom, or to disgrace and death. But for the first time since the attack, Kimberly felt a sense of rightness about their path forward. Alan rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out into the darkness where their enemies had disappeared hours before. When he turned back to her, his expression was resolute. Then we begin planning tomorrow, he said. We will need to be smart about this, careful about who we approach and how we present our case. One mistake could cost us everything. Kimberly joined him at the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape that had become both sanctuary and trap. Somewhere down in the valley below, Jake Morrison and Billy Crawford were struggling through the snow, carrying with them the lie that would supposedly end Wayne Nelson's hunt for Gregory Mitchell. But lies had a way of unraveling, especially when built on foundations of fear and desperation. The next few days would be crucial. They would need to gather evidence, make contact with trustworthy authorities, and prepare for a confrontation that would determine the course of their future lives. It would require all of their combined intelligence, courage, and determination. But as Kimberly looked at Alan's reflection in the window glass, she felt a confidence she had never experienced before. They were no longer just two desperate people clinging to each other for survival. They had become something more dangerous and more powerful. They had become partners in the truest sense, united by shared trials and common purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The mountain wind picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them of the harsh realities that surrounded their small oasis of warmth and light. But inside the cabin, plans were taking shape that would soon carry them back into a world they had tried to leave behind. The exile was ending, and the real battle was about to begin. As if sensing the gravity of the moment, Alan reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both intimate and symbolic. Whatever happened next, whatever trials awaited them in the valley below, they would face them as they had faced the attack on their home. Together, united and utterly determined to reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them. The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows across the cabin walls, but neither of them moved to add more wood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new opportunities for both triumph and disaster. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of violence and the tense anticipation of battles yet to come, they had found something worth fighting for. They had found each other, and they had found the courage to fight back. The storm outside was finally passing, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. But inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Two people who had come together out of necessity and mutual need were discovering that they had become something neither had expected. They had become dangerous. The first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, but the beauty of the mountain sunrise could not dispel the weight of what lay ahead. Kimberly stood at the cabin window, watching the light creep across the valley below where their enemies had vanished into the darkness. Somewhere down there, Jake Morrison and Billy Crawford were either dead from their wounds in the brutal cold, or they were spinning lies to Wayne Nelson about Gregory Mitchell's demise. Either way, the reprieve would be temporary. Alan moved quietly behind her, checking their supplies with the methodical precision she had come to associate with his military bearing. 2 weeks had passed since the attack, 2 weeks of careful planning and preparation for a journey that might end in vindication or death. They had decided to make their move before the heavy snows made travel impossible, before Nelson grew suspicious of his men's prolonged absence. The plan they had crafted was audacious in its simplicity. They would travel to Denver, where Alan still had contacts from his engineering days, men who might be willing to listen to his story and examine the evidence they had gathered. Chief among these was Judge Harrison Webb, a man Alan remembered as incorruptible and fair-minded, someone who might be willing to look beyond the scandal that had destroyed Gregory Mitchell's reputation. But first, they needed more than just their word against Wayne Nelson's carefully constructed lies. They needed proof, documentation, testimony from witnesses who could corroborate their version of events. And that meant taking risks that could expose them to their enemies before they were ready to face them in a court of law. "Are you certain about this?" Alan asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood exactly what he was asking of her. "Once we leave this mountain, there will be no turning back. If our gamble fails, we will likely face the hangman's noose together." Kimberly turned from the window to face him, seeing not the broken exile she had first encountered, but a man who had rediscovered his strength and purpose. The weeks of planning had transformed him, had awakened the engineer and leader he had once been. But she could also see the concern in his gray eyes, the knowledge that he was asking her to risk everything on a desperate throw of the dice. "I am certain," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. "We cannot live our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next group of bounty hunters to find us. If we are going to have a future together, it must be built on truth, not on lies and hiding." The words carried more weight than either of them had expected. In the weeks since the attack, their relationship had deepened beyond the practical arrangement that had brought her to the mountain. What had begun as mutual need had evolved into something far more profound, a partnership built on shared danger and mutual respect that had gradually blossomed into love. Alan crossed the room to stand before her, his hands gentle as they framed her face. The calluses on his palms spoke of years of hard work and self-reliance, but his touch was tender as he searched her eyes for any sign of doubt or fear. "Then we go together," he said simply. "As partners, as equals, as two people who refuse to let injustice define their lives." The kiss that followed was different from the desperate passion they had shared on the night of the attack. This was deeper, more certain. A promise sealed between two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and were determined not to let go. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them crackled with electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. But even as they held each other, the practical realities of their situation intruded like cold water. They had supplies for a week's journey, assuming good weather and no delays. Their horses were strong, but not accustomed to winter travel through mountain passes, and they would be traveling through territory where Wayne Nelson's influence might reach, where a chance encounter with the wrong person could spell disaster. The journey down the mountain began at midday, when the sun was high enough to provide some warmth and visibility. Alan led the way on his sturdy gelding, while Kimberly followed on the mare he had acquired for her use. Behind them, the cabin that had been their sanctuary grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely among the snow-laden pines. The trail was treacherous, made worse by ice and recent snowfall that obscured familiar landmarks. More than once, they were forced to dismount and lead their horses through particularly dangerous sections, where a single misstep could send them tumbling into the rocky gorges below. But Alan's knowledge of the mountain paths proved invaluable, and by evening they had descended far enough to reach the relative shelter of the lower valleys. They made camp in a grove of aspens that provided some protection from the wind, building a small fire that they hoped would not be visible to any watchers in the darkness beyond. As they shared a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were no longer the mountain hermit and his mail-order bride. They were fugitives, traveling under assumed names with forged papers that Alan had prepared during their weeks of planning. The transformation was more profound than either had anticipated. Kimberly found herself constantly scanning the shadows for threats, her hand never far from the pistol Alan had insisted she carry. The woman who had once been afraid of her own shadow had become someone capable of violence when necessary, someone who would not hesitate to defend what she held dear. Alan, meanwhile, had shed the resigned acceptance that had characterized his years of exile. The careful planning required for their mission had awakened the strategic mind that had once made him a successful engineer. He moved with purpose now, his gray eyes alert for danger, but no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past failures. On the second day of travel, they encountered their first real test. A group of miners heading up into the high country recognized Alan, despite his attempts at disguise, their faces lighting up with the avarice of men who smelled easy money. But instead of the broken hermit they expected to find, they faced a man who had rediscovered his strength and a woman who was clearly prepared to use the weapon at her side. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Alan's calm explanation of their business, backed by Kimberly's unwavering support and the obvious quality of their equipment and horses, convinced the miners that they were dealing with people of substance rather than easy prey. The would-be bounty hunters decided that discretion was the better part of valor and continued on their way without further incident. But the encounter served as a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. Word of their passage would spread, carried by loose tongues and the promise of easy money. They needed to reach Denver quickly before Wayne Nelson learned of their survival and moved to intercept them. The third day brought them to the outskirts of Colorado Springs, where they faced their first major decision. They could continue directly to Denver, maintaining their momentum but risking exposure in the more populated areas. Or they could take a longer route through the less traveled mountain passes, trading speed for security but risking being caught by early winter storms. Alan chose speed over caution, a decision that would prove both wise and dangerous in equal measure. They pushed hard through the day, changing horses at way stations and avoiding the larger towns where their faces might be recognized. By evening, they were within a day's ride of Denver, closer to their goal than either had dared hope when they first conceived their desperate plan. But their luck could not hold forever. As they approached the final range of hills that separated them from the city, they spotted riders behind them on the trail. 3 men, well-mounted and traveling with the purposeful urgency of hunters who had caught the scent of their prey. Checkpoint 13. The pursuit that followed was a nightmare of mud and ice, desperate spurring through treacherous terrain as their enemies slowly gained ground. Alan's gelding was strong, but tired from days of hard travel, while Kimberly's mare was beginning to favor her left foreleg in a way that suggested injury or strain. Behind them, the bounty hunters rode with the relentless determination of men who could taste their reward. It was Kimberly who spotted the solution, a narrow canyon that branched off from the main trail and disappeared into the rocky heights above. It was a risk, potentially a trap that could leave them cornered with no way out. But it also offered the possibility of losing their pursuers in the maze of stone passages that honeycomb the Colorado mountains. Alan made the decision without hesitation, spurring his horse toward the canyon mouth as bullets began to whistle past their heads. The bounty hunters had closed to within rifle range, and their shots were growing more accurate with each passing moment. One bullet shattered a tree branch just inches from Kimberly's head, sending splinters flying like deadly rain. The canyon proved to be everything they had hoped and feared. It offered concealment from their pursuers, but also presented a labyrinth of passages that could easily become a death trap for the unwary. Alan's knowledge of geology served them well, his trained eye reading the rock formations and water patterns that indicated which passages were likely to lead to safety rather than dead ends. For 3 hours they played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the stone corridors, sometimes hearing their pursuers' voices echoing from the walls nearby, sometimes catching glimpses of movement in the passages above. But gradually, Alan's superior knowledge of the terrain began to tell. The bounty hunters, unfamiliar with the canyon system, began to fall behind as they were forced to backtrack from false leads and impassable routes. When they finally emerged from the canyon as the sun was setting, they were alone. The bounty hunters had either given up the chase or become lost in the maze of stone passages behind them. But the victory had come at a cost. Both horses were exhausted, and Kimberly's mare was now clearly lame. They would not be able to maintain their pace much longer. The lights of Denver twinkled in the distance like earthbound stars, so close they could almost taste freedom. But between them and the city lay miles of open country where they would be vulnerable to attack, and their weakened mounts might not be able to carry them to safety before their enemies regrouped and resumed the pursuit. It was then that fate intervened in the form of a freight wagon heading toward the city. Its driver, a grizzled old man who took one look at their exhausted condition and offered them a ride without being asked. His name was Thomas Murphy, and he had been hauling supplies between Denver and the mining camps for more than 20 years. He asked no questions about their circumstances, but his weathered eyes suggested he had seen enough of frontier life to understand that sometimes good people found themselves in bad situations through no fault of their own. The ride into Denver passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of Murphy's draft horses. Alan and Kimberly huddled together in the back of the wagon, surrounded by sacks of flour and mining equipment, their weapons ready but concealed beneath their travel cloaks. Every other traveler on the road was a potential enemy, every distant rider a possible threat. But as the city grew larger around them, as the scattered farms and ranches gave way to actual streets and buildings, Kimberly felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope, not the desperate, fragile hope of people with no other options, but the solid, substantial hope of those who had fought for their chance at justice and were finally within reach of their goal. Denver in the winter of 1887 was a city in transition, growing rapidly as the mining boom brought wealth and opportunity to the Colorado Territory. The streets bustled with activity despite the cold, merchants and miners and businessmen all pursuing their various schemes and dreams. It was exactly the kind of place where two fugitives might disappear among the crowds, where the right connections could open doors that had seemed permanently closed. Judge Harrison Webb maintained offices in a substantial brick building near the center of town, his practice having grown considerably since Alan had known him in the old days. The man himself had aged well, his hair now silver but his bearing still erect and commanding. When Alan and Kimberly were finally ushered into his private office, Webb's initial shock at seeing his old friend was quickly replaced by the careful attention of a jurist evaluating evidence. The story they told was extraordinary, but the documentation they had brought was compelling. Letters from Wayne Nelson offering bounties for information about Gregory Mitchell, testimony from witnesses who had seen the money changing hands in mining camps and saloons. Most damaging of all, a confession letter that Jake Morrison had written during his fevered delirium in the root cellar, a rambling account of Nelson's instructions and the true purpose of their mission to the mountain. Webb listened without interruption, his experienced eyes moving between the documents and the faces of his visitors. When they finished their account, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he considered the implications of what he had heard. "This is a serious matter," he said finally. "If your allegations are true, Wayne Nelson has committed multiple felonies, including conspiracy to commit murder and the suborning of perjury. But proving these charges in court will require more than documentation. We will need witnesses willing to testify, evidence that can be verified independently." "We understand the challenges," Alan replied. "But we also understand that this may be our only chance to clear my name and expose the truth about what really happened 5 years ago." Webb nodded slowly, his expression grave. "There is something else you should know. Wayne Nelson has not been idle during your absence. He has used his wealth and influence to position himself as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman and philanthropist. Any accusations against him will be met with skepticism and resistance from those who have benefited from his largesse." The warning was sobering, but not unexpected. They had always known that their enemy would not be easily defeated, that the battle ahead would require more than just truth and justice. It would require strategy, patience, and the kind of careful maneuvering that Alan had learned during his years as an engineer, and Kimberly had developed during her transformation from frightened refugee to determined partner. But they also had advantages that Nelson might not expect. The mountain had changed them, had forged them into something harder and more resilient than the people they had been before. They were no longer the naive young engineer and the desperate spinster seeking safety. They were survivors, fighters, people who had faced death together and emerged stronger for the experience. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Webb began the complex process of building a case against Wayne Nelson. Witnesses had to be located and interviewed, documents authenticated and filed with the court, legal strategies developed and refined. Through it all, Alan and Kimberly worked as a team, their complementary skills and shared determination, making them formidable allies in the fight for justice. But their enemy was not idle either. Word of their presence in Denver had reached Nelson within hours of their arrival, carried by the network of informants and paid agents he had cultivated over the years. His response was swift and predictable, a combination of legal maneuvering and more direct threats designed to discourage their efforts and protect his carefully constructed reputation. The first attempt on their lives came on their fourth night in the city as they were returning to their hotel after a late meeting with Webb. The assassins were professionals, skilled men who struck from the shadows with knives rather than guns, seeking to make their victims' deaths look like the result of a simple robbery gone wrong. But the mountain had taught Alan and Kimberly lessons that served them well in the urban jungle. They moved with the wariness of people who had learned that danger could come from any direction, and when the attack came, they were ready. The fight was brief but vicious, ending with 2 dead assassins and a clear message that Wayne Nelson was willing to kill to protect his secrets. The incident convinced Webb that his clients needed protection, and he arranged for them to stay in a safe house while the legal proceedings moved forward. It was a modest dwelling in a quiet neighborhood, but it felt like a palace after the primitive conditions of the mountain cabin. More importantly, it was secure. Watched over by men, Webb trusted and defended by precautions that would make another assassination attempt extremely difficult. As winter deepened and the legal battle intensified, Alan and Kimberly found themselves changing yet again. The desperate fugitives who had fled the mountain were evolving into something new. People who had learned to fight not just for survival, but for principle. The process was not without its costs, but it was also liberating in ways neither had expected. Checkpoint 14. The trial of Wayne Nelson began on a cold February morning, with snow falling steadily outside the courthouse windows and a packed gallery of spectators eager to witness the downfall of one of Denver's most prominent citizens. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Morrison, with Judge Webb serving as special counsel, had built a meticulous case based on the evidence Alan and Kimberly had provided and the additional witnesses they had uncovered during their investigation. Nelson himself cut an impressive figure in the defendant's chair, his expensive suit and carefully groomed appearance projecting an image of respectability and success. His legal team was equally impressive, a collection of the city's most skilled defense attorneys, backed by unlimited resources and a willingness to use any tactic necessary to secure their client's freedom. The early days of the trial were a battle of narratives, with the prosecution painting Nelson as a vindictive schemer who had used his wealth to destroy an innocent man, while the defense portrayed him as a victim of extortion and false accusations by desperate criminals seeking to escape justice. The testimony was technical and often tedious, focusing on financial records and documentary evidence that meant little to the average observer. But everything changed when Alan took the stand to tell his story in his own words. Gone was the broken hermit who had hidden on the mountain for 5 years, replaced by a man who spoke with quiet dignity about the destruction of his life and his long journey back to the truth. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity, a straightforward account of betrayal and persecution that resonated with everyone in the courtroom. Kimberly's testimony was equally powerful, though in a different way. She spoke not as a victim but as a witness to Nelson's crimes, describing the attack on their mountain home with clinical precision and unwavering courage. Her transformation from frightened mail-order bride to determined partner was evident in every word, and the jury listened with rapt attention as she recounted their fight for survival and justice. The defense's cross-examination was brutal, attempting to portray both Alan and Kimberly as desperate criminals willing to say anything to avoid punishment for their alleged crimes. But their story held together under the most aggressive questioning, supported by documentation and corroborated by witnesses whose credibility could not be challenged. The turning point came when Jake Morrison took the stand, his scarred face and halting speech testimony to the violence he had both inflicted and endured. His account of Nelson's instructions and the bounty offered for Alan's death was devastating, made all the more powerful by his obvious reluctance to testify against his former employer. Morrison's testimony was followed by a parade of witnesses from the mining camps, rough men who had no love for the law, but who were willing to speak the truth about the money Nelson had spread around in his quest for vengeance. Their accounts painted a picture of systematic corruption and intimidation that extended far beyond the simple matter of a personal grudge. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Frances Reed, now Frances Nelson, took the stand as a hostile witness, her beauty and sophistication unable to conceal the calculating coldness that had destroyed so many lives. Under aggressive questioning from Webb, she was forced to admit details about the original theft and frame-up that she had kept hidden for 5 years. Her testimony revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed Gregory Mitchell's life. The theft had been planned and executed by Frances and Wayne Nelson together, with Alan chosen as their scapegoat because of his trusting nature and his access to the families they had robbed. The evidence had been carefully planted, witnesses bribed or intimidated, and official records altered to support their version of events. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the city beyond. Wayne Nelson was not just a man seeking revenge against a supposed criminal, but the architect of an elaborate fraud that had destroyed an innocent man's life and reputation. The case that had begun as a simple matter of assault and conspiracy had become something far more significant, a reckoning with the corruption that had infected Denver's business and social elite. The defense's closing arguments were desperate, relying on character assassination and appeals to class prejudice to overcome the mountain of evidence against their client. They portrayed Alan as a bitter failure, seeking to blame others for his own shortcomings, and Kimberly as a woman of questionable morals who would say anything to protect her lover. But the prosecution's closing was devastating in its simplicity. Webb stood before the jury and methodically dismantled every element of Nelson's defense, using the man's own words and actions to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he was guilty of the charges against him. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony unshakable, and the pattern of corruption undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Wayne Nelson, pillar of the community and respected businessman, was revealed as the criminal he had always been. The sentence was 20 years in federal prison, with restitution ordered for his victims and forfeiture of assets obtained through criminal activity. But the victory came with costs that extended beyond the courtroom. The trial had exposed not just Nelson's crimes, but the web of corruption that had enabled them, implicating dozens of other prominent citizens in various schemes and frauds. The scandal rocked Denver's elite society and led to a series of investigations that would continue for years to come. For Alan and Kimberly, the verdict represented more than just legal vindication. It was the end of their exile, the restoration of Alan's good name, and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives together. The mountain had forged them into the people they needed to be to fight this battle, but the courtroom had proven that their transformation was complete. As they left the courthouse together, walking through the falling snow toward an uncertain but hopeful future, they were no longer the desperate fugitives who had fled the mountain months before. They were partners in the truest sense, two people who had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged stronger for the experience. The city around them buzzed with news of the trial and its implications, but they paid little attention to the excitement. Their focus was on each other and on the life they would build together, a life based on truth and justice rather than lies and hiding. The mountain had taught them to survive, but the courtroom had taught them to thrive. Behind them, Wayne Nelson was led away in shackles, his empire of corruption crumbling around him. Frances Nelson, her own legal troubles just beginning, watched from the courthouse steps as the man she had betrayed walked free into the Colorado snow. The wheel of justice had turned at last, bringing retribution to those who had thought themselves above the law. But for Alan and Kimberly, the end of the trial was not an ending but a beginning. They had work to do, a life to build, and a love to nurture that had been tested by fire and proven stronger than steel. The mountain had been their sanctuary, but the world beyond was their destiny. The snow continued to fall as they walked through the streets of Denver, two people who had found each other in the wilderness and refused to let go. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they might face, they would meet them together. They had learned the most important lesson the mountain could teach, that love and justice, when combined with courage and determination, could overcome any enemy and survive any trial. The transformation was complete. The frightened mail-order bride and the broken exile were gone, replaced by a woman of strength and a man of honor who had reclaimed his rightful place in the world. Their story would be told for years to come, a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. But that was for others to remember and retell. For Alan and Kimberly, the future beckoned with all its promise and possibility. They had survived the mountain, defeated their enemies, and found something more precious than gold or reputation. They had found each other, and that was worth more than all the riches in the Colorado Territory. Checkpoint 15. Spring came early to Colorado that year, melting the snows and opening the mountain passes weeks ahead of schedule. Alan and Kimberly stood on the platform of the Denver train station, watching the bustle of travelers and freight handlers as they prepared for their own journey back to the mountain that had been their sanctuary and their testing ground. The months since the trial had been a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. Alan's vindication had opened doors that had been closed for years, bringing offers of employment and partnership from engineering firms across the country. The settlement from Wayne Nelson's estate had provided them with financial security beyond anything either had dared imagine during their desperate days as fugitives. But perhaps more importantly, the trial had given them something that no amount of money could buy: the knowledge that they had fought for justice and won. The corruption that had infected Denver's elite had been exposed and punished, and dozens of Nelson's victims had received restitution for their losses. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. Now they were returning to the place where their transformation had begun, not as refugees seeking shelter, but as free people choosing their own destiny. The cabin on the mountain would be their home again, but it would be a different kind of home than the one they had left. It would be a place of choice rather than necessity, a sanctuary built on love rather than desperation. The train that would carry them west was a marvel of modern engineering, a far cry from the desperate flight through mountain passes that had brought them to Denver months before. But as they settled into their seats and watched the city disappear behind them, both felt a sense of completion rather than escape. They were not running from anything anymore. They were running towards something far more precious. The journey back to the mountain took 3 days by train and stage, a comfortable trip that gave them time to plan and dream about their future together. Alan had accepted a position with a surveying company that would allow him to work from their mountain home, mapping the mineral resources of the Colorado Territory for Eastern investors. It was work that would use his engineering skills while keeping them close to the place that had become their spiritual home. Kimberly had her own plans, projects that had taken shape during the long winter months in Denver. She intended to establish a school for the children of the mining camps, bringing education and opportunity to young people who might otherwise have no chance for advancement. It was ambitious work, but she had learned that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was exactly as they had left it. The winter snows had damaged nothing essential, and the spring sunshine streaming through the windows made everything seem bright and welcoming. But as they walked through the familiar rooms, both were struck by how small it seemed after the grand houses and hotels of Denver. It was not the place that had changed, but themselves. That evening, as they sat by the fire that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their relationship, Alan pulled out a small wooden box he had been carrying since their departure from Denver. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a ring of simple gold, set with a single diamond that caught the firelight like a captured star. "We have been through a marriage ceremony of fire and trial," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have faced death together, fought for justice together, and built a life together based on truth rather than convenience. But I want to make it official, to pledge myself to you before God and the law as well as in my heart." Kimberly's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. The frightened woman who had climbed this mountain seeking only safety and security was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was not afraid to claim the happiness she deserved. "Yes," she said simply, extending her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes, to all of it, to the marriage, to the life we will build together, to the future that we have earned through our courage and determination." The kiss that followed was different from all the others they had shared. It was not desperate with fear or urgent with passion, but deep and certain with the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious in each other. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling through their tears. The wedding took place a month later, in the small church in the valley below, where Alan had once been shunned as a hermit and suspected criminal. But times had changed, and the story of their fight for justice had made them celebrities of sorts. The church was packed with well-wishers, including many of the miners and ranchers who had once viewed them with suspicion. Judge Webb traveled from Denver to perform the ceremony, his presence lending official weight to the proceedings. Thomas Murphy, the freight hauler who had helped them reach the city during their desperate flight, served as Alan's best man. Even Jake Morrison attended, his scarred face solemn but peaceful, as he watched the couple he had once tried to destroy pledge their lives to each other. The ceremony itself was simple but moving, with vows that spoke not just of love, but of partnership, of two people who had chosen to face whatever challenges life might bring as equals and allies. When Webb pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in cheers that echoed off the mountain peaks like thunder. But it was the reception afterward that truly marked their acceptance back into the community they had once fled. Neighbors who had once whispered about the strange hermit and his mail-order bride now celebrated their triumph over injustice and corruption. Children who would benefit from Kimberly's planned school ran between the tables, their laughter a promise of the future she hoped to build. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Alan and Kimberly stood together on the church steps, looking out over the valley that had once seemed so hostile and unwelcoming. It was the same landscape they had viewed with such trepidation months before, but everything had changed. Not the mountains or the forests, but their place within them. They were no longer outsiders seeking acceptance or refugees fleeing from their past. They were home, in every sense of the word. They belonged here, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they had chosen this place in this life with full knowledge of its challenges and rewards. The years that followed were rich with purpose and accomplishment. Alan's surveying work took him throughout the Colorado Territory, mapping resources and planning development projects that would bring prosperity to isolated communities. His reputation as an honest and skilled professional grew steadily, erasing the last traces of the scandal that had once destroyed his life. Kimberly's school became a model for education in the mining camps, attracting students from hundreds of miles away and earning recognition from educational authorities in Denver and beyond. Her transformation from frightened mail-order bride to respected educator became a story told throughout the territory, inspiring other women to believe in their own potential for growth and achievement. But perhaps their greatest accomplishment was the marriage itself, a partnership that deepened and strengthened with each passing year. They faced challenges together, celebrated victories together, and built a life that was richer and more meaningful than either could have achieved alone. The mountain that had tested them so severely became the foundation of their happiness, a place where love had triumphed over fear and justice had overcome corruption. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching the sunset paint the peaks in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Alan pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning from Denver. It was from Wayne Nelson's former lawyer, informing them that the last of the legal proceedings stemming from the trial had been completed. All of Nelson's victims had received full restitution, and the man himself had died in prison the previous winter. His empire of corruption finally collapsed. It should have felt like closure, the final chapter in a story that had begun with betrayal and exile. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something they had learned long ago, that justice, while sometimes slow, was ultimately inevitable. The truth had a way of emerging, no matter how deeply it was buried or how powerful the forces arrayed against it. But more than that, it confirmed the wisdom of the choice they had made to fight rather than flee, to stand and face their enemies rather than spend their lives in hiding. The mountain had taught them to survive, but the courtroom had taught them to thrive. The combination had made them stronger than either could have been alone. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Kimberly leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their porch, night creatures were beginning their ancient rituals of hunting and survival. But here, in the circle of light cast by their oil lamps, there was only peace and contentment. The frightened woman who had climbed this mountain seeking only safety and security was gone, transformed into someone who understood that true security came not from hiding, but from facing life's challenges with courage and determination. The broken man, who had sought exile from a world that had betrayed him, had been reborn as someone who understood that redemption was possible for those willing to fight for it. Together, they had built something precious on this mountain, something that would endure long after they were gone. Not just a marriage or a home, but a testament to the power of love and justice to overcome any obstacle. Their story would be told for generations, inspiring others to believe that no matter how dark the circumstances, there was always hope for those brave enough to reach for it. The mountain wind sighed through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine and the promise of another winter to come. But Alan and Kimberly no longer feared the isolation or the challenges that the changing seasons would bring. They had learned the most important lesson the mountain could teach, that love, when combined with courage and determination, could overcome any enemy and survive any trial. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, the same stars that had witnessed their first desperate night in the cabin, their fight against the bounty hunters, their triumph in the Denver courtroom, and now their quiet contentment on this anniversary evening. The mountain that had tested them so severely had become their greatest teacher, showing them truths about themselves and each other that they might never have discovered in easier circumstances. As they finally rose to go inside, Alan paused to look back at the valley below, where lights twinkled in the windows of the homes and businesses that had grown up around the mining camps. It was a different world than the one they had known during their years of exile, more prosperous and civilized, but still wild enough to challenge those who chose to make their lives there. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference in the lives of others. Kimberly's school would welcome a new class of students, eager young minds hungry for knowledge and opportunity. Alan's surveying work would take him to unexplored regions of the territory, mapping resources that would shape the development of the American West for decades to come. But tonight, there was only this moment of perfect peace, this sense of completion that came from knowing they had fought the good fight and emerged victorious. They had faced their enemies and defeated them. They had confronted injustice and overcome it. They had found love in the most unlikely circumstances and nurtured it into something beautiful and enduring. The cabin door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the mountain night but not the memories of all they had shared within these walls. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of all the stories these walls had witnessed. Stories of fear and courage, of desperation and hope, of two people who had found each other in the wilderness and refused to let go. Outside, the mountain stood eternal and unchanging, its peaks crowned with snow that glowed silver in the starlight. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. The frightened mail-order bride and the broken exile were gone, replaced by a woman of strength and a man of honor, who had proven that love and justice, when combined with unwavering determination, could triumph over any adversity. Their transformation was complete, their victory assured, their future bright with promise. The mountain had tested them and found them worthy. Now it would be their home forever, a place where they had learned the most important truth of all, that sometimes the greatest journeys begin not with a destination in mind, but with the simple courage to refuse to give up when giving up would be the easiest thing to do. The fire burned low as they prepared for sleep, but the warmth it had kindled in their hearts would burn forever, a testament to the power of love to transform even the most broken lives into something beautiful and whole.